The period from 1500 to roughly 1800 is the period of time associated with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. These two events in Western European history are sort of aligned chronologically usually, and they grow out of the age of the Renaissance, which was born in Italy, particularly around areas like Florence, Italy, and very much centered on humanist thought. The scientific revolution is usually dated from about 1500 to about 1700. And sometimes you find very specific dates. Oftentimes you'll see the scientific revolution as being beginning in 1543, which was the year that Copernicus, the Polish astronomer, when his work after his death was published, revealing that the Earth went around the sun. The Enlightenment, usually is dated from about 1600 to 1800, but some of the dates on that vary. And that's an age of really philosophy and thought centered on concepts like politics, government's rule of law, ethics, these types of things. And usually the Enlightenment is associated beginning with individuals like René Descartes, who was the thinker who basically created much of the basis for modern science after his publication of his works where he proposed his cogito ergo sum, which is the term that means I think, therefore I am. This idea that knowledge could be obtained through observation from a rational thinking being. The painting you see here is a painting that carries a great deal of meaning for this period of time. This is a French salon. Salons during the period of this age of revolutions in science and philosophy were actually in well-off people's homes, and they were hosted. If you look at the painting closely, you will notice, which might surprise you, that there are actually a number of women in this group of people. Women hosted these salon gatherings, and they were gatherings of people from the middling classes of the bourgeoisie as well as from upper classes who were involved in the inquiries of knowledge and education, whether it be philosophy or whether it be science or history, music, and so forth. And so this was where really so much of the thinking of this period of time occurs in these types of events, which brought the well-off people of society together to then think about works of individuals like Voltaire, the works of individuals like Montesquieu, the great thinkers of the time, the works of individuals like Christian Huygens, the famous Dutch scientist, mathematician, and astronomer. They would come together, they would read their works, they would play music, they would sample food from this now increasingly interconnected world. And women actually increasingly played an important role in this because women were the hostess. Women were the individuals that hosted these gatherings. They caroused with these important people. They shared ideas. And in many cases, these types of gatherings opened the door for women to take a sort of unconventional route to becoming thinkers of these greater revolutions in science and philosophy themselves. Understanding the cosmos. How do we understand the cosmos? During the Middle Ages, the way that people understood the cosmos was really centered around the doctrine of the Ptolemaic conception, the geocentric theory of the cosmos, which the church had basically borrowed from antiquity and argued that effectively the earth was the center of the universe, the sun and the stars and the planets went around the earth. And that effectively embraced Catholic doctrine because that suggested that the purpose of of the cosmos, of the plants and animals on the earth and so forth, was basically to service humans. That humans were the cradle of civilization, or the cradle of God's creation, that God had created humans as effectively a strata of creatures just below the angels and above the plants and the animals and other things. The understanding of the Copernicus of the cosmos, the understanding of the cosmos was transformed by the works of Nikolai Copernicus. He was a Polish astronomer, and it should be noted that these thinkers are, all of them, by and large, very Catholic or very religious nonetheless. Copernicus was a Catholic, and he used his telescope to understand his observations, I should say. He used his observations to discover what becomes known as the Copernican system, or the Heliocentric Theory, which we know to be a fact, that the sun is actually the center of the solar system, and the earth and the planets go around the sun. Copernicus actually understood how controversial this theory was, and for that reason he refused to publish his findings until he died. And in 1453, when Copernicus died, his works are published. And it really begins the scientific revolution, which very much breaks apart the ideas held by the Catholic Church about humanity's place in the cosmos, in God's creation. Johannes Kepler, the Danish thinker, discovers laws of planetary motion, which is based on the idea that the orbits of the planets were steady and unchanging. They got faster, closer to the sun. They were elliptical in shape rather than perfect circles. Galileo, the Italian astronomer, famously develops his telescope based on a spyglass from the Dutch, what will be the Dutch Republic. It was based on a spyglass of Dutch manufacture, his telescope, and he uses it to build his own telescope. And by the way, during the period of revolutions in science and philosophy, the Dutch Republic was really one of the places where a person might go if they want to read published works that are controversial elsewhere, if they want to publish important works of philosophy. It's one of the places where a person could go and study and publish with less of a threat of extreme punishment. The Dutch were interested in science. They were interested in economics. They were a global entity too, a very small country, but they were actually on the cutting edge of global exploration. They had early corporations that would establish trading expeditions. They had expeditions going all the way to Asia. Indonesia was a colony of the Dutch. So they were a scientific-minded culture that allowed for a pretty widespread amount of publishing of findings of science and philosophy and so forth. It was one of the places to go if you wanted to learn what the Western world really had to offer at this time in the way of discoveries of knowledge. And so Galileo built his telescope on the basis of a Dutch spyglass. He uses his telescope to discover things like the Jupiter system, the Jovian system with Jupiter and its moons. Jupiter has 4 large moons, and with a telescope you can see them, and Galileo saw them because you can see their shadow passing in front of the planet. That meant that there were other planetary systems out there. Here you had moons going around Jupiter, which basically proved that everything did not go around the Earth. He developed things like the principle of inertia, an understanding of of fundamental basics, the principles of planetary motion and thermodynamics and these types of things are rooted in some of the discoveries of Galileo. Galileo discovered sunspots and was, for this reason, an incredibly influential astronomer. His contemporary Giordano Bruno, who would write and theorize that the other stars were suns with Earth-like planets undoubtedly going around them. Galileo had been imprisoned under house arrest, and that's where he died. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake. And that really speaks to the implications for the church. These discoveries are really undermining the doctrine of the basis of church doctrine. The heavens are not the heavens anymore. The earth is not the literal center of God's creation anymore. And for this reason, many of these individuals were made to suffer terribly as a result of this. Later, you will see Sir Isaac Newton in his Principia publish about laws of gravity. But Newton believed that the universe was like a machine. Eventually, by the 20th century with Albert Einstein, we understand that the universe is expanding and energy is moving towards increasing sort of chaos. And this is in the theories of entropy and relativity by Albert Einstein. We know today that the Earth is but a mere speck in its galaxy, on the outer fringes of the Milky Way galaxy, which is just the Milky Way, just a speck in a universe in which there are more galaxies than there are grains of sand on the Earth. That all really, these revelations all started with technology, shared across Europe, fundamental groundbreaking discoveries by individuals in the scientific revolution. And in this sense, it really is the beginning of how we understand the universe and the cosmos today, the 21st century. Women actually played a very important role in the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Now, European society is still extremely patriarchal. I mean, it's very male-dominated. And so society has not yet gotten to a point where they're taking the step of allowing women to be treated as equals across European society. It was almost impossible for women to get into a university, though some women were enrolled and disguised themselves as males to go to college. So it was a very patriarchal society, and that limited opportunities for women. But nonetheless, women played a central role in the scientific revolution for a number of reasons. First of all, when you come to the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, you're talking about much of the sharing of ideas and considering or considerations about philosophy, about ethics, right? About justice, about law, about discoveries of the cosmos in the theories about life elsewhere. That stuff happened in salons. And in this case, a salon, we're not talking about a place where a person goes to have their hair done. Salons were gathering places in houses of well-off members of society. And women hosted these gatherings. And it allowed them to share ideas, to listen, to be part of a conversation with some of the greatest intellectuals of the age, like, for example, Voltaire or Christian Huygens in the Netherlands. Women also were fundamental players in the Enlightenment and scientific revolution on their own right. Margaret Cavendish, who is pictured here, was an English writer who is largely associated with the emergence of the novel. So the printing press from Gutenberg in the 1400s, the printing press results in more publishing in people's spoken vernacular, their spoken language. And that results in greater literacy, which then gives rise to more people reading. And it gives rise to publications. Again, the Dutch Republic is where you'd want to go if you wanted to publish things that were controversial. That would be probably the ideal place for a cutting-edge thinker during this period of time. Margaret Cavendish wrote a book called The Blazing World. These were called utopian novels. In a way, it's kind of like an early science fiction book with fantastic peoples in a fantastical world. Individuals like Maria Winkelmann was an astronomer who published in her own right on discoveries, who made credible discoveries of her own on the nature of the cosmos. In fact, 1 in 7 German astronomers were actually women. And a lot of that had to do with the role that women, again, played in working with professors and husbands in these fields at the time. There were entomologists, and entomologists studies insects, and in this case, butterflies. Maria Marion went to Dutch Suriname and created a catalog of the various types of butterflies in Dutch Suriname, becoming one of the forerunners of the field of entomology. It might surprise us to learn that at the time, despite these incredible achievements and this fundamental role played by women in the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, that thinkers during this time period, this would be called the debate on the nature of women. Thinkers at this time, nonetheless, often still sought to enforce, rather than undermine, society's beliefs in both gender and racial inferiority. So despite the contributions of these individuals that were very obvious, they played a very fundamental role, many of the scientific revolutionaries and many of the thinkers of the Enlightenment still sought to enforce rather than undermine their beliefs in gender and racial inferiority, despite the fact that if they were actually rationally looking at the evidence in front of them, they would know that beliefs in gender and racial inferiority are fundamentally false and untrue.